October 25, 1415. A recently plowed field in northern France. Days of rain have turned it into a quagmire. Thick clinging mud that will swallow men whole. 8,500 starving, diseased English soldiers are pinned here. They've been running for 2 weeks, desperately trying to reach the safety of Calais. But the French blocked every river crossing, shadowed them for days, and now 20,000 French knights have cut off the road ahead. There's no escape. The English are trapped between this muddy field and annihilation. The mathematics are impossible. Outnumbered 3-1. No food. Ravaged by dysentery. Standing in ankle-deep mud that will become the decisive weapon of the day. But not in the way anyone expects. Before we begin, if you find value in this story, please hit the like button and drop a comment. It genuinely helps us reach more people who love history told honestly. Thank you. What happens in the next few hours will redefine medieval warfare. The mud you're standing in will kill more French knights than English arrows. And the King of England will make a decision so brutal that it will haunt his greatest victory forever. But to understand how an English king ended up trapped in this French mud with no way out, we need to go back to when England's greatest warriors were already dead. The great lions of England were dead. Edward III, the warrior king who had humbled France at Crécy and built an empire of conquest stretching from Calais to Gascony, died in 1377. He was old, senile, controlled by his grasping mistress while his kingdom crumbled around him. The man who had made France kneel died without dignity, without power, a shadow of the conqueror he'd been. His eldest son never got the chance to inherit. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, terror of France, victor of Poitiers, had died a year earlier in 1376. Dysentery took him at 45, his body broken by decades of campaigning in French mud and French blood. The prince, who had captured a French king, died in a bed, unable to rise, unable to even hold a sword. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the last of the great Plantagenet princes, followed in 1399. He left behind a son whose claim to the throne was dubious and whose hold on power would prove fragile as morning frost. With them went England's fortunes in France. The Treaty of Bretonnie signed in 1360 after the catastrophic French defeat at Poitiers had given England nearly a third of France. Aquitaine, Poitou, Ponthieu, Calais, and its surrounding pale, vast territories purchased in English blood and French humiliation. On paper, England controlled more of France than some French dukes, but treaties made by giants cannot be defended by their heirs. By 1375, the brilliant Constable of France, Bertrand d'Aigues-Guesclin, had recaptured almost everything through a patient strategy of siege warfare and avoidance of pitched battle. He refused to give the English the grand cavalry charges they'd slaughtered at Seine-Poitiers. Instead, he starved out garrisons, bribed commanders, wore down the occupiers through sheer methodical persistence. English garrisons fell one by one. Castles that had cost thousands of lives to capture were surrendered for want of supplies or reinforcements. By 1380, only Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne remained of the great continental empire. Everything else gone. Worse, France and its Castilian allies controlled the sea. French GS raided the English coast with impunity. Plymouth burned. Hastings burned. Even Gravesend, within sight of London, was put to the torch. The island kingdom that had once dictated terms to half of Europe found itself unable even to defend its own shores. Fishermen and coastal villagers lived in terror of French sails on the horizon. And internally, England was tearing itself apart. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, proved to be an erratic, autocratic ruler who alienated his nobility through favoritism, extravagance, and increasingly paranoid behavior. He executed or exiled his critics. He surrounded himself with Yes, men. He declared himself beyond the law. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, returned from exile with an army. Richard's support collapsed like wet parchment. He was deposed, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and died there under mysterious circumstances in early 1400. Murdered. Most likely, though no one could prove it. The usurpation created a wound-in English legitimacy that would fester for generations. Henry Boling became Henry IV, but he would spend his entire reign fighting rebellions, conspiracies, and the knowledge that he'd broken the sacred bond between king and crown. Yet from this moment when England seemed broken, bankrupt, and beaten, would emerge one of the most celebrated warrior kings in English history. A man who would transform his realm, reinvigorate its military prowess, and win a victory so complete, so improbable, that it would echo through the centuries. His name was Henry V. But in 1403, he was just a 16-year-old boy being sent to war. When Henry Boling seized the throne and became Henry IVTH in 1399, few believed his dynasty would survive a single winter. He had deposed an anointed king, a sacred crime that violated the divine order itself. God had chosen Richard II. Henry had unchosen him. That sort of transgression didn't go unpunished. Rebellions erupted almost immediately. In Wales, Owen Glyndwr raised the dragon banner and declared himself Prince of Wales, beginning a revolt that would consume the region for over a decade. Glyndwr wasn't just a rebel. He was an Oxford-educated lawyer, a skilled military commander, and a Welsh nationalist who genuinely believed he could restore Welsh independence. He burned English settlements, ambushed English columns, and made the mountainous terrain a graveyard for anyone loyal to Henry IV. In the north, the powerful Percy family, who had helped Henry to the throne, turned against him when their promised rewards failed to materialize. They'd expected lands, titles, money. What they got were more demands for soldiers and more wars to fight. Gratitude, it turned out, had a very short shelf life. Henry Hotspur Percy was the most celebrated warrior in England. At 39, he'd already fought Scots, French, and Welsh rebels. He'd won tournaments, commanded armies, and earned a reputation for personal bravery that bordered on recklessness. When Hotspur allied with Glyndwr and marched on the king with 8,000 men in the summer of 1403, it looked like Henry IV's reign was about to end as quickly as Richard II had. Henry IV sent his 16-year-old son to stop them. Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, was blooded early and blooded hard. In the Welsh campaigns, he learned the brutal arithmetic of counterinsurgency. Burned villages produced fewer rebels. Hanged rebels discouraged rebellion. Scorched earth meant no food for the enemy. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't chivalrous. But it worked. At the Battle of Shrewsbury on July 21, 1403, young Henry commanded a division of the royal army and took an arrow in the face. The shaft struck him just below the right eye and drove 6 in deep into his skull. He should have died instantly. Instead, he stayed on his feet, bleeding, half blind, and kept fighting. The wound nearly killed him later. The arrowhead was lodged so deep that conventional extraction would have destroyed the bone, and likely caused fatal infection. A surgeon named John Bradmore designed a specialized instrument, essentially a hollow screw that could grip the arrowhead from the inside and slowly withdraw it. The procedure took weeks. Henry endured it without anesthetic. Beyond alcohol and prayers, he bore the scar for the rest of his life, a puckered indentation below his right eye, that he never tried to hide. But at Shrewsbury, even wounded, he displayed a precocious military talent. His decisive cavalry charge into Hotspur's flank turned the battle. The rebel line broke. Hotspur himself was killed, struck down in the melee. His body hacked apart by men who wanted to be sure he was dead. The prince was 16 years old and had just won his father's throne for him. For the next decade, as Henry IV's health deteriorated, young Henry increasingly assumed the reins of government. The king suffered from a disfiguring skin disease, possibly leprosy, possibly something else, along with debilitating seizures that left him incapacitated for weeks at a time. His face became so hideous that he refused to appear in public. He wasted away in darkened chambers while his son ruled in everything but name. By 1410, Henry of Monmouth was effectively King of England. The prince who emerged from this crucible was formidable. Chroniclers describe him as tall and athletic with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone he met. He was noted for his administrative competence, personally reviewing financial accounts and legal disputes. He had a genuine fondness for music and collected instruments. He was pious, attending Mass regularly, and supporting church reform. He also had a wild streak, tavern brawling, womanizing, late nights in London's seedier districts, bitter public quarrels with his father over policy, money, and power. Some chroniclers claim he once struck the Chief Justice of England during an argument. Others say he led a gang of young nobles in robberies for sport, though these stories are probably exaggerated. What's certain is that when Henry IVTH finally died on March 20, 1413, everyone expected the dissolute prince to become a dissolute king. They were wrong. While England struggled with usurpation and rebellion, France was destroying itself with something far worse. In August 1392, King Charles VI of France suffered a catastrophic psychotic break while riding through a forest near Leu. A ragged man suddenly grabbed his horse's bridle and screamed that the king was betrayed, that enemies surrounded him. Charles drew his sword and began attacking his own retinue. He killed 4 men before his knights could subdue him. They had to tackle him from his horse and wrestle the blade from his hands while he screamed incoherently. He would never fully recover. The episodes became worse over time. Charles would go months without bathing, convinced that washing would kill him. Servants had to burn his clothes and replace them while he slept because he refused to change. He believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He refused to let anyone approach him, shrieking and backing into corners when courtiers came near. He sometimes didn't recognize his own wife and children, insisting they were impostors sent to trick him. For the next 30 years, France would be ruled by a madman who spent long periods completely detached from reality. The wealthiest, most powerful kingdom in Christendom was governed by a man who thought he was made of glass. This created a power vacuum that would prove catastrophic. Initially, Charles's younger brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, seized control of government. Louis was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly unscrupulous. He enriched himself flagrantly from the royal treasury, signing documents that diverted tax revenue to his own estates. He continued the expensive draining war with England because mil-sin military contracts meant money and patronage he could distribute to his supporters. He conducted an affair with Queen Isab that was barely concealed. Some historians believe he fathered several of Charles's children. He made enemies. Chief among them was his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The Duchy of Burgundy had become one of the great powers of Europe. Through inheritance and strategic marriages, the dukes controlled not just Burgundy itself, but also Flanders, Artois, and other wealthy territories in the Low Countries. The wool trade from Flanders alone generated revenues that exceeded those of many kings. John the Fearless, short, bull-headed, graceless, but supremely capable, had inherited this vast domain. in 14 and immediately began to clash with Orleans over control of France. The two men disagreed on everything. Orleans supported the Avignon papacy during the Great Schism. Burgundy backed Rome. Orleans wanted continued war with England to reclaim lost territories. Burgundy needed peace to protect the Flemish wool trade with England. Orleans controlled Paris and the royal court. Burgundy was shut out of power and seething with resentment. Factions formed. Orleanist supporters wore one set of livery colors. Burgundians wore another. Street violence erupted in Paris between rival gangs. Provincial nobles declared for one side or the other. France was fragmenting along factional lines while its king babbled about being made of glass. On the night of November 23, 1407, Duke Louis of Orleans was returning from visiting the Queen at the royal residence. He was riding his mule through the narrow streets of Paris, accompanied by only a few servants and torchbearers. As he passed along the Rue Viardot, masked men emerged from the shadows. They dragged him from his mule into the street. He tried to defend himself, raising his left hand. They hacked it off with a sword. Then they beat him to death with axes and blades, striking him 18 times. His body was left in the gutter, blood pooling in the frozen mud. 3 days later, John the Fearless publicly confessed to ordering the assassination. He didn't apologize. He didn't express remorse. Instead, he had a theologian from the University of Paris deliver a public lecture justifying the murder. The scholar argued that Louis of Orleans had been a tyrant, a threat to the realm, and that tyrannicide was morally permissible when undertaken for the public good. John the Fearless attended the lecture and nodded approvingly throughout. France erupted into civil war. Louis' son Charles became the new Duke of Orleans at 13. Advised by his grandfather, Bernard IV, Count of Armagnac, the young duke swore a blood oath of vengeance against John the Fearless. He raised an army. "How generous of the Dauphin," Henry said quietly. "These balls are soft and light, made for gentle games. I shall send him balls in return, balls of iron and brass delivered by siege cannon that will knock down his father's palace walls and wake all of Paris from their sleep." He turned to his council. "The Dauphin thinks I'm young and frivolous. He thinks England is weak. He thinks he can mock God's anointed king without consequence." Henry's voice didn't rise, but it hardened like steel cooling. "He will learn otherwise. Summon every captain. Draw up the contracts. Empty the treasury if you must. I want the largest army England has fielded in 50 years. He paused, still holding the tennis ball. "And when we land in France, I want the Dauphin to understand something. Those who mock gods will do not get to laugh for long." The machinery of war began turning immediately. Messages went out to every corner of England. Contracts were drawn up. Captains began recruiting. Blacksmiths worked overtime forging arrowheads by the tens of thousands. Shipwrights prepared vessels. The treasury opened its vaults. By summer 1415, Southampton was filling with men, weapons, and ships. Henry had engineered his war. The Dauphin had given him the moral justification. Now came the hard part, actually winning it. Medieval warfare wasn't a matter of pointing at a map and shouting, "Attack." It was bureaucracy, logistics, contracts, money, lots of money. Henry V employed the indenture system that had evolved over the previous century, a method that was remarkably modern for its time. He contracted with 320 individual captains, ranging from great dukes to minor knights. Each captain signed a legal document specifying exactly what they would provide and what they would receive in return. The contracts were specific down to the penny. A duke received 13 shillings, 4 pence per day. A knight received 2 shillings. A man-at-arms received 1 shilling. An archer received 6 pence. The contracts also specified length of service, typically 6 months to a year, division of ransoms and plunder, disciplinary procedures, and what happened if a soldier deserted or a captain failed to deliver his promised troops. It was war as a business transaction. And it worked. By summer 1415, the army gathering at Southampton numbered approximately 12,000 men, the largest English force assembled since Edward III's campaigns. But the makeup was revolutionary in a way that worried Henry's more traditional nobles. 8,000 of those men were archers, commoners mostly, yeoman farmers from the shires who'd grown up shooting longbows at targets in their village squares as English law required. Only 2,500 were men-at-arms and knights, the armored elite who'd traditionally dominated European warfare. Previous English armies had been built around heavy cavalry. Knights in plate armor trained from childhood, representing the peak of military power. Henry's army flipped that ratio. For every 1 man-at-arms or knight, there were more than 3 archers. It was a calculated gamble based on careful study of Crécy and Poitiers, where massed longbow fire had slaughtered French cavalry. But those had been defensive victories, fought from prepared positions. Henry was planning an invasion. Could archers hold their own in offensive operations? Could they survive if French knights actually reached their lines? Henry believed they could. His nobles were less certain. But the king wasn't asking for opinions. Then, just days before the fleet was scheduled to depart, the entire invasion nearly collapsed. A conspiracy was uncovered. Richard, Earl of Cambridge, Lord Scrope of Masham, and Sir Thomas Grey had been plotting to kill Henry and place Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, on the throne. The plan was to kill the king before he could sail, throw England into chaos, and stop the French campaign. The plot was betrayed by Mortimer himself. He went directly to Henry and revealed everything. The arrests happened on August 2, 1415. All 3 conspirators were seized, tried before a hastily assembled court, and convicted within 24 hours. Richard and Grey were beheaded the next day. Lord Scrope's execution took longer, not because of any legal complication, but because of who he was. He'd been Henry's close friend. They'd fought together in Wales. Scrope had been at Shrewsbury when Henry took an arrow to the face. He'd been part of the inner circle for years. The council quietly suggested that perhaps the king might show mercy. Perhaps exile instead of execution. Perhaps. No, Henry said. Treason admits no friendship. Scrope was beheaded on August 5. His head was sent to York and displayed on a spike above the city gates as a warning. If anyone still doubted that the wild prince had truly died, Scrope's execution ended those doubts. The man who'd once brawled in taverns with his companions had just executed his closest friend without hesitation. 6 days later, on August 11, 1415, the invasion fleet departed Southampton. Nearly 1,500 vessels filled the harbor and the approaches. Everything from massive 500-ton cogs to small barges and fishing boats pressed into service. The fleet carried 12,000 men, thousands of horses, siege equipment, supplies, weapons, and enough arrows to darken the sky over France 100 times over. Henry sailed aboard his flagship, the Trinity Royale, a 540-ton monster that was the largest ship in the fleet. He stood on deck as the English coast faded away, surrounded by his captains and advisors, watching the other ships spread out across the water in a formation that stretched for miles. On August 14, the Norman coast appeared through the morning haze. The fleet landed near Chef de Cox at the mouth of the Seine estuary. Soldiers poured onto the beaches. Horses were unloaded. Equipment was hauled ashore. Within hours, 12,000 English troops stood on French soil for the first time in years. Henry gathered his commanders and pointed at a fortified port city 3 miles upriver. "Harfleur," he said. "We take it first. It will be our Calais in Normandy, a permanent English stronghold." No one knew it yet, but that decision would nearly destroy the entire army before the campaign even began. Harfleur should have fallen in a week. It had a garrison of barely 400 men. The English army had 12,000. The math was simple. The math was also wrong. Henry's heralds rode to the city gates on August 17 and demanded surrender. The response came from Raoul de Gaucourt, the garrison commander, a scarred, gray-haired warrior who'd been fighting the English since before Henry was born. "Tell your king," de Gaucourt called from the walls, "that he may sit outside as long as he wishes. We will wait." It wasn't empty talk. Harfleur's defenses were impressive: thick stone walls, multiple baileys creating rings of defense, strong towers at every corner, fresh water from wells inside the city, and a commander who knew exactly what he was doing. The siege began that same day. Henry's engineers dug mines to undermine the walls, tunneling through earth and rock. Cannons and trebuchets pounded the fortifications, hurling stone balls that weighed 300 pounds. Assault towers were built and rolled toward the walls. Other nobles rallied to him, appalled by the brazen murder. Charles's supporters became known as Armagnacs after his grandfather. John the Fearless followers were called Burgundians. For the next 8 years, France was consumed by vicious factional warfare. Paris changed hands multiple times, each time followed by purges and executions. Armies pillaged the countryside, stripping villages bare and leaving populations to starve. Both sides sought English support, offering territorial concessions in exchange for troops. The Burgundians offered Flanders. The Armagnacs offered Aquitaine. Both sides were willing to sell France piecemeal if it meant destroying their rivals. The Kingdom of France, the wealthiest, most populous realm in Christendom, was tearing itself apart while its king sat in the Louvre, refusing to bathe, convinced he was made of glass. Into this chaos stepped the new King of England, and he would exploit it mercilessly. April 9, 1413. Westminster Abbey. A freak snowstorm was blanketing London. Snow in April, heavy enough to turn the streets white. Some called it an omen. Others called it divine judgment. Henry V didn't care what they called it. He walked through the storm to his coronation with his head uncovered, letting the snow settle on his hair. The dissolute prince was dead. What walked into that abbey was something else entirely. The transformation was immediate and total. Within days of his father's death, Henry dismissed every companion from his wild years. The drinking partners, the brawlers, the men who'd spent years at his side, gone. He recalled advisors his father had trusted, men he'd personally opposed and argued with for years. He attended Mass 3 times daily. He stopped drinking wine. He began reviewing every major legal case personally, spending hours reading petitions from common subjects. Courtiers who'd known him for years barely recognized him. The man who'd spent nights in taverns now spent them in prayer. The prince who'd brawled in the streets now lectured his council on the importance of justice and moral rectitude. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow reformation. It was as if someone had taken the old Henry and replaced him with a completely different person wearing the same face. Shakespeare would later dramatize this as the wild prince, how revealing his true noble self. The reality was stranger and more unsettling. This wasn't a mask coming off. This was a new mask being put on, and Henry wore it with absolute conviction. He became obsessed with moral purity, with righteousness, with the idea that God had chosen him for a sacred purpose, and that obsession had teeth. In early 1414, his old friend, Sir John Oldcastle, was discovered leading a heretical sect called the Lids. They rejected papal authority. They denied that bread and wine literally became Christ's body and blood during Mass. They preached in English instead of Latin. They claimed the church was corrupt and needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Oldcastle wasn't just a heretic. He was plotting to kidnap the king, force church reform, and reshape England's religious landscape. He'd been Henry's friend. They'd fought together, drunk together. The prince would have protected him. The king showed no mercy. Oldcastle escaped the initial arrests, but his followers didn't. Henry had them rounded up, dozens of men, some of whom had known the king personally. They were given a choice, recant or burn. Most recanted. Those who didn't were taken to Smithfield and burned alive while the king watched from a distance. When Oldcastle was finally captured in 1417, Henry designed his execution personally, hanged in chains over a fire. Not hanged until dead, then burned. Hanged while the fire burned beneath him so he would strangle and roast simultaneously, conscious for as long as possible. The execution took hours. Heresy, Henry declared to his council, must be rooted out with fire. There can be no compromise with those who corrupt God's truth. But if Henry was merciless toward heresy, he was equally passionate, obsessed even about what he saw as England's sacred rights in France. He studied the old treaties. He consulted with lawyers about the legal foundations of English claims to French territory. He spoke about Aquitaine, about Normandy, about the lands his great-grandfather had conquered with the same fervor he brought to discussing theology. God had given England those lands. France had stolen them. It was Henry's divine duty to take them back. He spent the first year of his reign preparing for war, not just militarily, diplomatically, legally, spiritually. He negotiated with the Burgundians and Armagnacs, playing them against each other. He stockpiled weapons and built up the treasury. He commissioned prayers for victory and consulted with theologians about the justice of his cause. By late 1414, he was ready. He sent an embassy to Paris with demands so extreme they could only be meant to provoke war. And when those demands were rejected with mockery, Henry smiled. He'd gotten exactly what he wanted. The English embassy that arrived in Paris in late 1414 wasn't there to negotiate peace. Was there to make peace impossible. Henry's demands were presented to the French court with all the formality of legitimate diplomacy. The lead ambassador read them aloud while the Dauphin Louis, acting as regent for his glass-obsessed father, sat on the throne and listened. The 1360 Treaty of Bretonnie was to be fully restored. Every territory France had reclaimed over the past 40 years would be returned to English control. Aquitaine pour poncher all of it. The unpaid remainder of King Jean II's ransom from 1356, nearly 60 years old, was to be honored in full, but Henry wasn't finished. England was also to receive Normandy and Maine and Anjou, plus overlordship of Brittany and Flanders, and Henry himself would marry Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter, with a dowry of 2 million gold crowns. The French council sat in stunned silence. The demands didn't just ask for what England had lost. They demanded twice what England had ever held, plus enough gold to bankrupt the French treasury 3 times over. The Dauphin was 18 years old, arrogant, and surrounded by Armagnac advisers who despised England. He didn't bother with diplomatic language. "Tell your boy king," he said, "that we have a gift for him." The ambassador was presented with a barrel. Inside were tennis balls. The message was delivered with a sneer. Perhaps the King of England should occupy himself with games suitable to his youth rather than troubling himself with matters of state and war. The insult was calculated, deliberate. The Dauphin wanted the English to know that France considered their demands and their king a joke. The embassy returned to England in early 1415 and delivered the barrel to Henry personally. The king opened it, looked at the tennis balls, lifted one, and examined it. Then he smiled, the same cold smile his counselors were learning to recognize. The smile that meant someone was about to suffer. "How generous of the doer," Henry said quietly. Assault towers were constructed and rolled toward the walls. 4 days, the bombardment was constant. The crash of stone on stone, the roar of gunpowder, the shouts of men. But Doro's garrison didn't sit idle. They sighed out at night, burning siege equipment and killing engineers. They dug countermines and collapsed the English tunnels before they could reach the walls. They repaired damage as fast as Henry's army could inflict it. Every assault was met with boiling pitch, crossbow bolts, and rocks dropped from above. Days became weeks. The easy victory turned into a grinding attrition. Then the sickness started. It began with the latrines with 12,000 men camped in a relatively small area near marshy River Este. Sanitation became impossible to maintain. The trenches overflowed. Water sources became contaminated. By late August, men were falling ill. Dysentery hit first. The bloody flux, soldiers called it. Men would feel their guts cramping, then spend hours, sometimes days, evacuating blood and waste until they were so dehydrated they couldn't stand. Some recovered, most didn't. They died in the medical tents or in their own filth, too weak even to crawl. The smell became unbearable. Thousands of men with diarrhea packed into a siege camp in August heat. The air itself seemed thick with disease. Soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces, but it didn't help. You could taste it. Then malaria arrived, spread by mosquitoes from the marshy ground. Men would burn with fever one day and shiver with chills the next. Their skin turned yellow. They vomited blood. The fever would break and they'd seem to recover. Then it would return and kill them. Mass graves were dug daily. At first, the dead received proper burials with priests and prayers. By September, bodies were just rolled into pits and covered with dirt. There were too many to do anything else. Among the prominent dead was Richard Courtenay, Bishop of Norwich, one of Henry's closest advisers and friends. He died of dysentery on September 15, delirious and incontinent, a prince of the church reduced to soiling himself like an infant before he expired. Henry himself visited the sick when he could, though his advisers begged him not to risk infection. He would walk through the medical tents, looking at men who'd been strong warriors weeks before and were now skeletal wrecks waiting to die. Some accounts say he wept. Others say his face remained hard as stone. What's certain is that he pushed the siege harder. More bombardments, more assaults. The attacks became desperate, almost reckless. Henry needed Harfleur to fall before his entire army rotted away. On September 22, after 6 weeks, Harfleur's gates finally opened. Duggar had run out of food. His garrison was starving. He negotiated surrender terms and marched out with his surviving men. Fewer than 200 left alive. Henry had won. He'd captured his second Colla. He had his permanent English stronghold in Normandy, but the cost was catastrophic. At least 2,000 men were dead. Another 2,000 were too sick to march. They'd have to be left behind or shipped back to England if ships could be found. A third of the invasion force was gone. The army that had landed at Chivo with 12,000 men now numbered barely 9,000 deployants, and many of those were weakened by illness. It was late September. The campaign season was ending. Autumn rains would soon turn roads to mud and make military operations impossible. And at Rouen, barely 50 miles away, a French army of 20,000 under the DOA and Constable Charles Dal was gathering. Henry convened his war council in the captured city. His advisers were blunt. "We must return to England," they said. "Garrison Harfleur and sail home. We've accomplished something. The city is ours. We can return next year with a fresh army." It was the sensible option, the safe option. But Henry hadn't emptied England's treasury and gathered the largest army in 2 generations just to capture one city and leave. "We marched to Killala," he said. His commanders stared at him. "Your Majesty, the French army, we marched to Killala." Henry repeated. "Through Normandy and Pontia, through territories that belong to England by right of treaty, we will demonstrate that these lands are ours. If the French want to stop us, let them try." It was a compromise between retreat and suicide. Abu 120m march through territory. England claimed but didn't. Control, ending at the safety of English, held Killala. It would be a demonstration of English authority, a reassertion of rights. And it would allow the army to withdraw without complete humiliation. On October 8, leaving a garrison of 1,200 men at Harfleur, Henry's diminished army of 9,000 Dan set out. They expected to reach Kala in 8 days. They had no idea they were marching into a trap. For 5 days, the march went almost perfectly. The English army followed the coastal route north, passing through villages that emptied at their approach. The weather held. The roads were solid. Small rivers at Brea and U were forded without incident. The water barely reached the horses' bellies. Morale battered by the siege began to recover. Men joked, sang marching songs. Killala was only a week away. They'd be safe, fed, and warm before October ended. Then October 13th arrived, and everything fell apart. The army approached Blanchetaque, the same ford across the Sceaux that Edward III had used before Ci. Nearly 70 years earlier. It was the traditional crossing point marked on every map known to every English commander. The plan was simple. Cross the S. Continue north. Reach Killala. Scouts returned at midday with news that made Henry's face go white. The ford was blocked. A French army of 6,000 men, under Constable Charles Delbret, was dug in on the far bank with sharpened stakes, trenches, and crossbowmen. They'd been waiting. They knew exactly where the English were going. Henry called a halt and studied his maps. There were other crossings, but all were upstream, east, away from Cal, deeper into French territory. Every mile east was a mile further from safety. He had no choice. The army pivoted and began marching along the southern bank of the Somme, searching for an undefended ford. But on the opposite bank, D'Albret's force shadowed them, matching their pace. When English scouts found a potential crossing, they'd see French banners already on the far side, waiting. It became a race, a desperate, grinding race between a starving English army trying to find a way across and a French blocking force determined to keep them trapped on the wrong side of the river. The weather turned. October rains came, cold and steady, turning roads into streams of mud. The supplies that were supposed to last 8 days began running out. Rations were cut, then cut again. Soldiers foraged in empty villages, finding nothing. The locals had fled or hidden everything. Men started eating unripe grain and green apples which gave them diarrhea on top of the dysentery. Many already had. Discipline began to fray. Soldiers fell out of formation to search for food and didn't return. Some deserted outright, taking their chances with the French rather than continuing this death march. The sick fell behind and were abandoned, left sitting by the roadside, too weak to continue, waiting for French patrols to capture or kill them. And the entire time on the far side of the river, D'Al's banners kept pace. Meanwhile, worse news was coming from the north. The main French army under the Dauphin had crossed the Somme at Abbeville, well ahead of the English position, and was now moving to cut off the road to Killala. Henry wasn't just racing D'Al anymore. He was being caught between two of French forces that were closing like jaws. The math was simple and horrifying. Delria had 6,000 men blocking the river. The DOA had at least 15,000 moving to intercept from the north. Combined, over 20,000 French troops hunting 9,000 starving, diseased Englishmen. For 6 days, the English marched upriver in increasingly desperate circumstances. The column stretched for miles as exhausted men struggled to keep pace. Knights dismounted and walked to spare their horses. Wagons were abandoned when they got stuck in mud. Equipment was discarded to lighten loads. At night, Henry would meet with his captains and study maps by candlelight, searching for options that didn't exist. Go back. The French were behind them. Stand and fight. They'd be slaughtered. Surrender. Henry would rather die. The only option was forward. Keep marching. Find a crossing. Pray. On October 19th, near the village of Betterners, scouts finally found 2 unguarded fords. The French had missed them or simply didn't have enough men to cover every crossing. The army worked frantically. Engineers laid causeways across the marshy approaches using anything they could find. Doors ripped from village houses, fence posts, tree branches. The cavalry crossed. First, then the archers, then the baggage train. It took hours. Every minute Henry expected to see French banners approaching. None came. By evening, the entire English army stood on the northern bank of the Somme. They'd escaped the trap, but they were now 50 mi east of where they should have been, deep in French territory, and had lost precious days. The army that should have reached Calala on October 16th was still 60 miles away on October 20th, with supplies gone and strength failing. Still, they'd crossed. The road to Calala was open. Henry ordered the march to continue immediately north toward safety, toward home. On the evening of October 24th, as the English army trudged along muddy roads in the fading light, they crested a low-rise between 2 stretches of woodland, and there, blocking the road about a mile ahead, was the entire French army. It wasn't a scouting party. It wasn't a blocking force. It was everything. Rank upon rank of mounted knights and men at arms stretching across the landscape. Banners by the hundreds. The blue and gold of the Valois. The personal standards of dukes and counts. The crosses of church militant. Cavalry on both flanks. Their armor catching the last light of day. An army so vast it seemed to fill the world. 20,000 men, maybe more. The exact count didn't matter. What mattered was that they were there and they weren't moving. Henry immediately deployed his own army into battle formation, expecting an attack. For over an hour, the 2 forces faced each other in tense silence. English archers knocked arrows. French knights adjusted their armor. Nobody moved. Then slowly and deliberately, the French army withdrew about 500 yards and took up position near a small village. They weren't retreating. They were settling in for the night, blocking the road, making their message absolutely clear. The road to Calala was closed. There was no way forward, no way around. The woods on both flanks were too dense for an army to pass through. Fight or surrender. Those were the only options left. That night, Henry ordered complete silence in the English camp. Any man who made a sound would lose an ear. The order was obeyed. 9,000 men sat in the dark and rain without speaking, without singing, many without even eating because there was nothing left to eat. Across the field, the French camp blazed with fires and rang with celebration. Dice clattered. Men argued loudly over which English nobles they'd capture and how much ransom they'd demand. Laughter carried across the muddy field. They'd already won. Tomorrow was just a formality. Dawn on October 25th, 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian broke gray and cold over a field that would become one of the most famous pieces of ground in history. The English had spent the night in the village of Missenel, pressed together for warmth in barns and against walls, trying to sleep while listening to the French celebration across the darkness. Some men prayed, others sat in silence, staring at nothing. A few checked their equipment obsessively, testing bow strings, sharpening arrows, tightening straps on armor that wouldn't save them. Henry himself barely slept. Accounts differ on what he did that night. Some chroniclers say he walked among his men in disguise, listening to their fears. Others say he spent the night in prayer. What's certain is that when dawn came, he emerged calm and composed, as if he'd already accepted whatever was about to happen. The field itself was a death trap. It stretched about 1,000 yards wide between two dense woods. The forest of Agincourt to the northwest, Treacherous wood to the northeast. The trees on both sides grew so thick that an army couldn't march through them. The only way forward was straight ahead, directly toward the French blocking position. The ground had been recently plowed for winter wheat. The furrows ran perpendicular to the line of advance, creating ridges and troughs that would break up any formation trying to cross. And the rain, days of steady October rain, had turned the entire field into a quagmire. The mud wasn't uniform. In some places, it was ankle-deep. In others, it reached the knees. Dark, clinging, cold mud that sucked at boots and hooves. This was where 9,000 Englishmen would have to fight 20,000 Frenchmen on ground that was already trying to swallow them before the battle even began. Henry's army formed up in a single line because that's all they had. There weren't enough men for multiple formations. No reserves to throw in if the line broke. Everything they had went into that one thin line stretched across the muddy field. 3 small divisions of men-at-arms formed the corps. On the left, Thomas Lord Camoes commanded perhaps 500 armored men. In the center, Henry himself led another 500. On the right, Edward Duke of York had the remaining 500. That was it. 1,500 heavy infantry to hold against whatever the French threw at them. Between and around these divisions, massed formations of archers deployed. 7,000 bowmen, most of them commoners from English shears who'd been shooting long bows since childhood. They were the backbone of the army now. Everything depended on whether their arrows could stop what was coming. Sir Thomas Herpingham commanded the archers. He was 58 years old, a grizzled warrior, who'd fought in Prussia, Lithuania, and France. He'd seen things that would have broken younger men. As he walked the line that morning, checking positions, he must have known the mathematics. 7,000 archers and 9,500 men at arms, against 20,000 French knights and men at arms. Even with the longbow's proven effectiveness, the numbers were grotesque. Each archer carried a 6-foot yew-bow capable of shooting 12 arrows per minute out to 250 yards. Each man also carried a wooden stake sharpened at both ends, which they now hammered into the muddy ground at an angle to create a defensive barrier. The stakes were meant to stop cavalry charges. Whether they'd actually work against the masked French heavy cavalry was about to be tested. Across the field, the French army was a vision of overwhelming power. They deployed in 3 massive lines: the vanguard, the main battle, and the rear guard. The first 2 lines were almost entirely dismounted knights and men at arms. The French had learned from Cra and Potier. No more cavalry charges into English arrows. This time they'd fight on foot, in full plate armor, presenting such a dense mass of steel that arrows supposedly couldn't stop them. On each flank, cavalry wings of 600 to 800 mounted knights sat ready. Their job was simple: ride down the English archers before the main battle closed. Once the bowmen were dead or scattered, the dismounted French knights would crush what remained. Command of the French army was technically held by Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Jean Touliangre, called Busico, professional soldiers with decades of experience. But they were vastly outranked by the princes of the blood who'd come for glory. Charles, Duke of Orleans, son of the murdered Duke, John Duke of Bourbon, Charles Duke of Alençon, and dozens of other high nobles, each commanding their own retinues, each expecting to have their say in how the battle was fought. The French plan was sound. Wait, let the starving English attack across that muddy field. Let them exhaust themselves, then crush them. It was the smart strategy, the professional strategy. But it required patience, and patience wasn't something French nobles had in abundance when glory was waiting. For 3 hours, both armies stood in the rain and waited. The French were in no hurry. Why should they be? The English were trapped, starving, outnumbered. Every hour that passed weakened them further. Let them stand in the mud. Let their hunger gnaw at them. Let their fear build. The longer this dragged out, the more complete the French victory would be. D'Alt and Busico understood this perfectly. Both were professional soldiers who'd spent decades learning their craft through hard experience. They knew that the English longbow was deadly, but had limits. Archers couldn't shoot forever. Each man carried perhaps 48 arrows in his quiver, maybe a few more stuck in his belt. Once those were gone, the archers became lightly armed infantry facing armored knights. The equation was simple. Wait them out. Force them to attack. Let the mud and exhaustion do half the work. But D'Alt and Busico weren't really in command. Not where it mattered. The nobles outranked them. Charles Duke of Orleans was a prince of the blood, grandson of a king. John Duke of Bourbon, same. Charles, Duke of Orleans, same. These men didn't take orders from mere constables and marshals, no matter how experienced. They took suggestions sometimes, and what the nobles wanted was simple. Attack, win glory, capture English prisoners worth enormous ransoms, demonstrate French superiority. Waiting was for cowards. Standing passive while an inferior enemy stood before you was humiliating. The murmuring started around 10 a.m. Why are we waiting? The English are right there. Look at them. Half-starved, diseased, terrified. We outnumber them 2-1. This isn't a battle. It's a harvest. Let's finish them and go home. D'Albret tried to maintain order. We wait. Let them come to us. The plan. The plan is to stand in the mud all day while English archers mock us. Duke of Alençon snapped. I didn't ride here to watch them from a distance. The pressure built. Nobles argued with commanders. Retinue grew restless. Knights who'd spent their entire lives training for battle, who'd paid enormous sums for their armor and horses, who'd come expecting glory, were being told to stand still and wait. The French army's greatest strength, its overwhelming numbers and noble cavalry, was also its greatest weakness. Too many commanders, too many egos, too many men who'd never been told no in their lives. And across the muddy field, Henry V understood this perfectly. He'd studied the French. He knew about the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. He knew about the fractured command structure. He knew that French nobles valued personal glory over tactical sense. He was counting on it. If the English waited, they'd slowly collapse from hunger and disease. If they attacked across open ground, they'd be slaughtered. But if Henry could provoke the French into attacking, he turned to his captains. We advance. They stared at him. Your Majesty, if we cross that field, we're not crossing the field, Henry said. We're moving into range. Then we stop and we make them come to us. It was audacious, insane, even Marching an army forward in battle formation without attacking required perfect discipline. If the line broke, if men panicked, the whole formation would collapse into chaos and be ridden down. But Henry had spent 12 years forging this army. He'd trained them in Wales, blooded them at Shrewsbury, drilled them relentlessly. If any English army could execute such a maneuver, it was this one. Around 11 a.m., after the army had attended Mass, and Henry had made a speech that chroniclers would later embellish into legend, the king gave the order that would decide the battle. Banners, advance. The entire English line began to move. 9,000 men, archers and men-at-arms together, pulled their sharpened stakes from the mud and began walking forward across the plowed field toward the French army. Not charging, not running, walking in formation, deliberately. It was an extraordinary maneuver. Each archer carried his stake in one hand, his bow in the other, trudging through mud that grabbed at every step. The men-at-arms in their armor moved even slower, their boots sinking deep with every step. But the line held. Nobody broke. Nobody ran. According to the chronicler Thomas Walsingham, Henry shouted the order in English. "Fellas, let's go. Fellows, let's go." Not French, not Latin. English, the language of common soldiers. The French watched in confusion. What was this? An attack? A retreat? The English were moving forward, but not charging. Their formation was intact. What were they doing? The English line advanced about 700 yards, close enough that a strong man with a long bow could reach the French lines, but far enough that they weren't in immediate danger. Then Henry raised his hand. Halt! The entire army stopped as one. Immediately, archers began hammering their stakes back into the ground, angling them forward to create a defensive barrier. It took minutes. The French could have charged during those minutes, could have caught the English disorganized and vulnerable. They didn't. They stood and watched, uncertain. Sir Thomas Herpingham walked along the archer line, checking stakes, ensuring everything was ready. He was old enough to be the father of most of these men. Some of them were barely 20 years old. Farmers who'd never seen a real battle. Now they were about to face the largest French army assembled in a generation. Herpingham reached the end of the line, turned and threw his baton high in the air, a signal visible across the entire formation. As it spun against the gray sky, he shouted, "Nro, now strike!" 7,000 long. Bowmen drew and loosed simultaneously. The sky went dark. Not metaphorically. Actually dark, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Thousands of arrows arcing. Up and forward. A howling swarm that climbed high and then plummeted down into the dense French formation. The sound was like heavy rain on a thatched roof, multiplied by 1,000. Arrows, striking armor, shields, earth. Most bounced off plate armor. At that range, a long bow couldn't punch through. Quality steel, but some found gaps, visors, joints, throats, and the psychological effect was devastating. The French cavalry horses panicked. They'd been standing still for 3 hours, cold and nervous, and now the sky was falling on them. Hundreds of arrows hitting around them, some striking their riders, some striking the horses themselves. The animals screamed and reared. Knights fought to control their mounts. Commanders on both French flanks made a split-second decision. They couldn't just stand there and be shot to pieces. The horses were already out of control. The only option was to turn panic into attack. Charge. Both cavalry wings, roughly 1,200 mounted knights total, spurred forward across the muddy field toward the English archers. It should have been magnificent. Should have been unstoppable. The flower of French chivalry, armored and mounted, thundering across the field to crush peasant bowmen. It wasn't. The horses couldn't gallop in the mud. What should have been a charge became a slow, labored advance. Hooves sank deep into the soft earth. The carefully dressed ranks began to break apart as faster horses pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind. Knights whipped their mounts, shouted, drove them forward, and the archers waited. They could see individual faces now, see the mud flying from hooves, hear the horses struggling, the knights cursing. The cavalry was perhaps 100 yards away, then 80, then 70. Draw, shouted. 7,000 men pulled bowstrings to their ears, arrows knocked, arms straining, waiting for the command. The cavalry was at 50 yards, close enough to see expressions, close enough to hear the labored breathing of exhausted horses. Loose. The volley hit. At nearly point-blank range, not from the front only, but from the flanks, too. Archers positioned in the tree lines on both sides of the field fired into the cavalry's exposed sides. Arrows that couldn't penetrate plate armor at 200 yards, punched through at 50. The bodkin point's narrow pyramidal designed specifically to defeat armor found every weakness. The gaps at shoulders and elbows, the thinner armor protecting the backs of knees. The eye slits in visors. Horses went down screaming, legs shattered, chests pierced. Knights were thrown from saddles or crushed under falling mounts. The charge disintegrated into chaos. Those who actually reached the English stake line found themselves channeled into narrow gaps where archers shot them from mere yards away or impaled on the sharpened stakes. Within minutes, the charge was over. Hundreds of horses and knights lay dead or dying in the mud. The survivors wheeled and fled back toward their own lines, panicked and broken, and they fled directly into Toula, into the path of the French vanguard, which was now advancing on foot. The first French battle, perhaps 8,000 men at arms in full plate armor, had begun trudging forward the moment the cavalry charged. The plan was for the cavalry to scatter the archers, then the dismounted knights would finish the job. But now their own retreating horsemen were crashing into their formation, breaking their ranks, creating gaps and confusion. And still, the arrows fell, thousands of them. A storm of wood and steel that never seemed to stop. The French vanguard kept advancing, stepping over their own dead, struggling through mud that grew worse with every yard. They were committed. Now, there was no turning back. The killing ground was waiting. The French vanguard was already dying before it reached the English line. 8,000 men at arms in full plate armor, the finest warriors France could produce, were trying to cross 300 yards of plowed field turned to mud. Each step was a struggle. Each yard gained came at the cost of energy they'd need when they finally reached the enemy. A 15th century. Knight's full-plate harness weighed between 50 and 60 pounds. Add the padding worn underneath, quilted gambeson to prevent the armor from chafing and to absorb impacts, plus weapons, helmets, gauntlets, and you had a man carrying 70 to 80 pounds of equipment. On solid ground, a trained knight could run, jump, even mount a horse while wearing it. In knee-deep mud, it became a death sentence. The French line began losing cohesion within the first 100 yards. Men couldn't maintain formation. The mud wasn't uniform. Some patches were merely ankle-deep, others reached the knees. Soldiers stumbled into deeper spots and struggled to pull themselves out. The furrows from plowing created ridges that tripped men who were already off balance from the weight they carried. Those in the front ranks tried to move faster, eager to close with the enemy and end the arrow storm. Those in the rear pushed forward, not wanting to be left behind. The result was compression. The entire vanguard began to bunch up, squeezing together as the formation narrowed to fit between the woods on either flank, and the arrows never stopped. 7,000 archers shooting 12 arrows per minute created a volume of fire that's difficult to comprehend. Even accounting for the time needed to retrieve arrows from the ground, or from supply bundles. The sheer density of projectiles in the air was unprecedented. The sky remained dark with them. At 200, most arrows bounced off plate armor. At 100 yards, more found gaps. At 50 yards, the bodkin points punched through weaker sections. The thinner armor at joints, the mail protecting armpits and groins, the strips covering the backs of knees. But even arrows that didn't penetrate had an effect. Getting hit in the helmet by an arrow at close range was like being struck with a hammer. The impact didn't pierce the steel, but it snapped heads back, broke noses inside helmets, caused concussions. Men staggered, disoriented, and fell into the mud. Some tried to get up. Most couldn't. Not with 70 pounds of armor weighing them down. Not with mud sucking at every movement. The wounded drowned in inches of water. The French vanguard kept coming because there was nowhere else to go. They couldn't retreat. The second battle was advancing behind them, pushing them forward. They couldn't spread out. The woods confined them to a narrowing funnel. The only direction was ahead, toward the thin English line, and the hope that once they reached it, once they could use their swords and axes and maces, this nightmare would end. By the time the vanguard closed to within 50 yards of the English line, they were already broken. Not in morale French. Courage was never the question, but physically shattered. Exhausted from crossing 300 yards of mud while carrying massive weight, breathless inside helmets that restricted air flow, disoriented from arrow impacts, bleeding from wounds that weren't fatal, but were weakening. And then the second French battle made everything worse. The main battle, another 5,000 to 6,000 men at arms, had started advancing shortly after the vanguard. They'd watched the cavalry charge fail. They'd seen their comrades struggling through the mud. But they came on anyway because that was the plan, because their commanders ordered it, because turning back was unthinkable. As they advanced, they compressed against the vanguard from behind. The funnel narrowing between the woods meant there wasn't room for both formations to deploy properly. Men in the front ranks of the main battle pushed into the rear ranks of the vanguard. The entire French army began to crush together into a dense, disordered mass. Men in the front couldn't retreat because men behind were pushing forward. Men in the back couldn't see what was happening at the front. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the screaming and the clash of metal and the constant thud of arrows hitting armor. The French vanguard finally reached the English line, not as an organized formation of professional warriors, but as an exhausted, compressed mob that could barely lift their weapons. Then, the real killing began. The impact when the two armies met was less a clash of arms than a collision of bodies. The French smashed into the English men at arms with the weight of thousands behind them. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like they might break through by sheer mass alone. Henry's center was driven back 10 yards, then 20. The thin English line bent under the pressure. On the right flank, Duke Edward of York's battle was in crisis, on the verge of complete collapse. Men were going down under the weight of French bodies. Gaps appeared in the formation. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, recognizable by the crown he wore over his helmet, a deliberate choice, making himself a target, showing his men he wouldn't ask them to face anything he wouldn't face himself. A contemporary chronicle records that the king's helmet was dented by axe blows and a decorative fleuron was cut from his crown. Charles, Duke of Alençon, broke through the English line and nearly killed Henry before being surrounded and cut down by the king's bodyguards. The English line was holding, but barely. A few more minutes of this pressure and it would shatter. Then 7,000 archers ran out of arrows and made a decision that would turn the battle into a slaughter. The archers had a problem. They'd shot thousands of arrows. The muddy ground around the French, dead and dying, was littered. with shafts, broken, embedded in bodies, stuck in armor. But retrieving them meant leaving position, and the melee was still raging 30 yards ahead. More critically, the English line was breaking. From their positions on the flanks and in the treacherous, the archers could see what the men-at-arms fighting in the center couldn't. The sheer weight of French numbers was about to crack the formation. Duke of York's right flank was collapsing. Men were going down. Gaps were opening. In minutes, the French would punch through, get behind the English line, and turn the battle into a massacre. The archers had no arrows left. They had no armor. Most were armed with nothing more than knives and maybe a hondax for cutting stakes. By every rule of medieval warfare, they should have retreated. Lightly armed commoners didn't engage armored knights in melee combat. That was suicide. But there was nowhere to retreat to. Behind them was nothing but 60 miles of French-controlled territory. If the line broke, they'd be run down and killed anyway. At least if they attacked, they'd die fighting instead of running. The decision spread through the archer formations without any formal order. The flanks, men dropped their bows, grabbed whatever weapons they could find, axes, hammers, mallets meant for driving stakes, swords pulled from dead French cavalry, and charged. Thousands of them, lightly armed peasants running into the flanks and rear of a formation of fully armored French knights. It should have been a slaughter. It was, but not the way anyone expected. The French were locked in place. The compression of too many men in too small a space meant those on the edges of the formation couldn't turn to face the new threat. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder, barely able to swing their weapons against the English men-at-arms in front of them, completely unable to defend their flanks. The archers swarmed over them like wolves on wounded deer. They didn't try to fight fair. They didn't try to match skill against skill. They attacked like men who knew they were going to die anyway, and decided to take as many enemy with them as possible. They grabbed knights from behind and pulled them down into the mud. They hammered at helmets with mallets, not trying to penetrate the armor, just hitting again and again, until the man inside was concussed or his neck broke from the impacts. They stabbed through the isolates in visors with knives and daggers. They attacked joints where armor was weakest, backs of knees, armpits, groins. A French knight, in full armor, standing upright with room to fight, could kill a dozen unarmored men. But a French knight on his back in the mud, weighted down by 60 pounds of steel, couldn't even stand up. And the archers weren't giving them the chance. The killing became systematic, methodical, brutal in a way that had nothing to do with chivalry or honor. This was peasants killing nobles with the same efficiency they'd used to slaughter pigs. Grab, pull down, stab, move to the next one. The French began to panic. Those in the rear of the formation, who couldn't see what was happening at the front, but could hear the screaming from the flanks, started to back away. The pressure pushing the vanguard forward suddenly released. Men who'd been compressed together now had room to move, but nowhere to go except backward, or down into the mud. The English men-at-arms, who'd been on the verge of breaking under the French assault, suddenly found the pressure easing. The French weren't pushing anymore. They were falling back, falling down, dying. Henry himself, bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. His helmet dented and his crown damaged, rallied his center. Push for England. Push. The English line surged forward. Not far. They were too exhausted for a sustained advance. But enough. Enough to turn a desperate defense into a counterattack. Enough to break the French will. The collapse happened section by section. First, the French right flank gave way. Men trying to escape the archers swarming their rear. Then the center wavered as soldiers realized they were surrounded. Then the left flank broke entirely. Within 20 minutes of the archers' charge, the French vanguard and main battle, nearly 13,000 men had disintegrated. Bodies littered the field, piled in some places 2 and 3 deep. The dead created obstacles that the living stumbled over. French knights trying to retreat tripped over corpses and went down in the mud where they were set upon by English archers and killed before they could rise. And still the mud claimed victims, wounded men who might have survived on dry ground, drowned in inches of muddy water, too weak to lift their heads. Knights, knocked down by the press of combat, suffocated when other bodies piled on top of them, the weight driving their faces into the muck. By midday, the battle was over. The French third battle, the rear guard, perhaps 7,000 strong and relatively fresh, took one look at the carnage and withdrew from the field without engaging. Their commanders weren't cowards. They were realists. Attacking now wouldn't change the outcome. It would just add their bodies to the piles. The English stood among the dead and dying, too exhausted to cheer, too shocked to fully comprehend what had just happened. They'd been outnumbered 3-1, starving, diseased, and trapped. By every rational calculation, they should have been annihilated. Instead, they'd won. The field was theirs. Thousands of French nobles, dukes, counts, barons were dead or dying, and thousands more were trying to surrender. Throwing down weapons, removing helmets, calling out their names and titles in hopes of being taken prisoner rather than killed. Ransoming noble prisoners was how common soldiers became wealthy. A captured duke could be worth 10,000 gold crowns, more money than a Iman archer would see in 50 lifetimes. The English soldiers began taking prisoners eagerly, sometimes 3 or 4 men guarding a single valuable captive. Within an hour, the English had taken perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners. Dukes, counts, barons, the cream of French nobility now disarmed and under guard. Then someone shouted an alarm from the rear of the English position. And everything went wrong again. The alarm came from the baggage train at the rear of the English position. Soldiers were pointing and shouting. Smoke rose from several wagons. A group of French cavalry, perhaps 600 men who'd never engaged in the main battle, along with armed peasants from nearby villages, had attacked the lightly defended supply train. They were looting, burning, killing the boys and servants left to guard the camp. It wasn't a military threat. It was a raid for plunder. But from the main English line 400 yards away, it looked like the beginning of a fresh attack. Then scouts brought worse news. The French third battle was still intact on the ridge to the north. 7,000 fresh troops who'd withdrawn but hadn't left the field. They were reforming, watching, waiting. Henry stood in the mud, surrounded by bodies, trying to calculate odds that had already shifted twice in one day. His army had just won an impossible victory, but they were in no condition to fight again. The men were exhausted. Many were wounded. They had expended nearly all their arrows. The formations were scattered across the field, mixed together, disorganized, and his army now held between 500 and 2,000 French prisoners. That was the problem. The prisoners vastly outnumbered their guards. They were disarmed, yes, but they still wore armor. The field was littered with thousands of discarded weapons, swords, axes, maces, daggers. If the French third battle attacked now, if the prisoners realized what was happening and rose up to rearm themselves, the English would be caught between two forces. They'd be slaughtered. Henry called his senior commanders together. The conversation was brief and brutal. The prisoners, someone said, if the French attack again, we can't guard them and fight, another added. We don't have enough men. Lord Camoes was blunt. Your Majesty, if those prisoners rise against us while we're engaged with the rear guard, we lose everything. The battle, the army, everything. Henry stood silent for a long moment, looking at the field, at the bodies, at the clusters of French nobles sitting in the mud under guard, some wounded, all exhausted, waiting to be ransomed, waiting to go home. The military calculation was clear. The moral weight was crushing. "Kill them," Henry said quietly. The commanders stared at him. "Your Majesty, the ransoms," I said. "Kill them." Henry's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "All of them now, but the laws of war. We're not debating this." Henry turned to face them directly. "If we're attacked while guarding prisoners, everyone dies. English and French both. I won't lose this army because we were too honorable to do what survival demands." It was a choice between certain death if they were wrong and potential dishonor if they were right. Henry chose survival. The order was given to the men at arms first. "Kill your prisoners." Most refused. These were nobles who understood the ransom system, who knew that killing unarmed captives violated every principle of chivalry. They had been raised to honor. Some of the prisoners were men they knew personally, opponents they'd faced in tournaments, fellow knights bound by the same code. They wouldn't do it. So Henry turned to the archers. 200 men were detailed for the task. Commoners who had no stake in chivalric honor, no expectation of ransom, no illusion that war was anything other than killing to survive. What followed entered the chronicles as one of the darkest moments in medieval warfare. The execution was systematic. The prisoners, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted, most still wearing armor, were stabbed, bludgeoned, and had their throats cut. Duke Antoine of Brabant, who'd arrived late to the battle and been captured almost immediately, was killed. Counts, barons, knights, men whose ransoms would have made their captives wealthy for life died in the mud beside common soldiers. Some prisoners begged, some prayed, some died in silence. The French chronicles claim many called out their names and titles, as if rank could save them. It couldn't. A few high-value prisoners were spared. Charles, Duke of Orleans, whose ransom would be politically useful. John, Duke of Bourbon, Marshal Busseau, perhaps a dozen others kept alive because Henry judged their strategic value worth the risk. But thousands died. Chroniclers differ on the exact number. Estimates range from 1,000 to 3,000 executed prisoners. What's certain is that more French nobles died in the massacre than had died in the battle itself. The English killed more unarmed prisoners than armed enemies. When the French Third Battle, still positioned on the ridge, saw what was happening, they withdrew completely. Whether they left in horror or in recognition that the battle was truly lost, the chronicles don't say, but they didn't attack. The threat Henry had feared never materialized. The English stood in the aftermath, surrounded by a field of corpses. The victory was complete. The French army was destroyed. The road to Killala was open. But the field at Agincourt now held something darker than a military triumph. It held a choice that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The soldiers who'd carried out the executions didn't speak much afterward. Those who'd refused stood apart from those who obeyed. Henry himself gave no explanation, made no public justification. He had given an order. It had been followed. That was the end of it. Later, chroniclers would debate endlessly whether it was justified, military necessity or war crime, pragmatic survival or moral catastrophe. The arguments would continue for centuries. What's not debatable is what Henry gained and what he lost that day. He'd saved his army, ensured their survival, guaranteed they'd reach Calais and return home. He'd won one of the most celebrated victories in English history. And he'd done it by ordering the deaths of thousands of helpless men who'd surrendered under the expectation that the laws of war would protect them. The Mud of Agincourt was already soaked with blood. Now it was soaked with something else, a stain that water couldn't wash away. That night, Henry ordered a count of the dead. Heralds walked the field in the fading light, stepping over and around bodies, trying to identify the French nobility by their armor and heraldic devices. It was grim work. Many bodies were so covered in mud and blood that identification was impossible. Others were piled so deep that reaching the bottom layers meant climbing over corpses. The numbers when they finally came in were staggering. French dead. Between 6,000 and 10,000 men. Modern historians favor the lower estimate, but even 6,000 represents a catastrophe. Among them were the cream of French nobility. Constable Charleroi, the supreme military commander of France, dead. Duke Charles of Alençon, Prince of the Blood, dead. Duke Antoine of Brabant, executed after capture. Duke Frederick of Bavaria, dead. Count Edward of Grand Prix, dead. Count Jean of Mal, dead. Over 90 barons and banan, perhaps 600 knights, names that filled pages in the chronicles. Men who'd ruled provinces, commanded armies, built dynasties, all dead in a single afternoon. Another 1,500 to 2,000 nobles had been captured and survived the massacre. The Duke of Orleans, who'd spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England. The Duke of Bourbon, Marshal Boucicaut, dozens of counts and barons who would eventually be ransomed for sums that would bankrupt their families. English losses were so light, they seemed impossible, between 400 and 600 dead in a battle against an army 3 times their size. The disparity was almost obscene. Among the English dead were Duke Edward of York, likely suffocated in the press of bodies during the melee, and the Earl of Suffolk, a handful of knights, some men-at-arms. But the vast majority of the army had survived. 7,000 archers had gone into battle. Perhaps 7,000 walked away from it. They had turned the field into a killing ground and emerged virtually unscathed. The casualty ratio was somewhere between 10 to 1 and 15 to 1. Victories like that didn't happen, except they just had. Henry stood among the carnage and offered thanks to God. Whatever doubts he'd had about his divine mandate, this seemed to confirm it. God had delivered the French into his hands. God had allowed 9,000 starving, diseased Englishmen to destroy an army of 20,000. This wasn't just a victory. It was a miracle. When Henry asked the name of the nearest castle and was told Agincourt, he declared that the battle would bear that name. As all battles must be named after the nearest fortress, he said, following the military tradition of the age, the name stuck. Agincourt, a muddy field between 3 villages that most people had never heard of, now immortalized. The English army remained on the field that night, too exhausted to move, too stunned to celebrate. Men sat in groups, speaking quietly or not at all. Some looted the French dead, searching for valuables. Others simply stared at the piles of bodies, trying to process what had happened. On October 26th, the army began the march to Killala. They moved slowly, still wary of another French attack, but none came. The roads were empty. Villages they passed were deserted. Populations fled or hiding. They reached Killala on October 29th. The garrison came out to meet them, expecting perhaps a battered remnant, fleeing French pursuit. Instead, they found an army carrying French banners, wearing looted French armor and claiming to have destroyed the largest French army assembled in years. The garrison didn't believe it at first. The story was too impossible. But the evidence was walking through the gates. Hundreds of captured French nobles, many still in their armor, some wounded, all defeated. Henry remained in Killala for 2 weeks, resting his army and arranging transport back to England. On November 16, he sailed from Killala and landed at Dover the same day. The reception was delirious. Bells rang across the city. Crowds gathered at the harbor, then followed the king's procession through the streets. By the time Henry reached London, the entire city had turned out. Elaborate pageants had been staged. Banners hung from every building. Poems were recited. Songs were sung. The king was hailed as a new Arthur, as God's chosen warrior, as the man who'd restored English honor and proven that the defeats of the past 40 years could be reversed. Henry V, who'd left England 3 months earlier with an army and a questionable plan, returned as the greatest warrior king since his great-grandfather Edward III. The crowds didn't know about the executed prisoners. Or if they knew, they didn't care. Victory erases many sins, and this was a victory that England desperately needed to believe in. Henry rode through the celebrations with the same controlled composure he'd shown throughout the campaign, acknowledging the crowds, accepting the adulation, playing the role of conquering hero because that's what the moment demanded. But those close to him noticed something. He didn't smile much. He attended Mass more frequently than ever. He spent long hours alone. The weight of Agincourt was already settling on him, and it would never fully lift. The celebrations lasted for weeks. But behind the pageantry and the poems, the strategic reality was clear. Agincourt had changed nothing. France was wounded, not defeated. The Armagnac faction had lost thousands of nobles at Agincourt. Yes, but the kingdom itself remained vast, wealthy, and capable of raising new armies. King Charles V still sat on his throne in Paris, intermittently, convinced he was made of glass, while the Dauphin continued to govern in his name. The civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians continued to tear the country apart. But that internal bleeding didn't make France any weaker against England. If anything, it made both factions more desperate to prove their patriotism by resisting the English invader. Henry had won a battle. He'd destroyed an army. He'd killed or captured much of the French military leadership. But he hadn't captured a single major city beyond Harfleur. He hadn't conquered any significant territory. He hadn't forced France to negotiate. Agincourt was a victory that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Henry understood this. The celebrations in London were useful for morale, for securing funding, for cementing his legitimacy. But they didn't win wars. So while England cheered, Henry began planning his return to France. It took 2 years to prepare. Wars required money, and the Agincourt campaign had drained the treasury. Henry needed Parliament to approve new taxes. He needed to recruit and train a new army. He needed ships, supplies, siege equipment, and this time he wasn't planning a raid or a quick campaign. He was planning conquest. In August 1417, Henry returned to Normandy with a fresh army and a different strategy. No dramatic marches, no seeking pitched battles. Instead, he began the methodical reduction of Norman fortresses one by one. Caen fell after a brutal siege. Files held out for months before surrendering. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, endured a siege that lasted from July 1418 to January 1419, 6 months of starvation that left thousands of civilians dead. It was grinding, unglamorous work, nothing like the glory of Agincourt, but it was effective. By 1419, Henry controlled all of Normandy. He had accomplished what no English king had managed since the 1340s, the permanent conquest and occupation of a major French province. And then John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was murdered. On September 10, 1419, John met with the Defensal. Louis had died in 1415 and his brother had inherited the title on a bridge at Montereau to negotiate an alliance against Henry. During the meeting, Armagnac partisans suddenly attacked John and hacked him to death with axes. Whether the Dauphin ordered it or simply failed to stop it remains unclear. What's clear is that John's son, Philip the Good, the new Duke of Burgundy, blamed the DOA and swore vengeance. And the enemy of Philip's enemy was his friend. In December 1419, Philip allied with Henry V against the Dauphin. The richest, most powerful duche in France had just switched sides. Combined English-Burgundian forces now dominated northern France. The Dauphin's Armagnac faction controlled the south, but they were isolated, outmatched, and facing enemies on multiple fronts. Henry had the leverage he needed to dictate terms. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420, was the greatest English diplomatic triumph in the 100 Red Years' War. King Charles I, in one of his lucid periods, or perhaps not, the chronicles differ, agreed to disinherit his son, the Dauphin. Henry V was recognized as heir to the French throne. When Charles died, Henry would become King of France and England, uniting both realms under one crown. To seal the alliance, Henry married Catherine of Valois, Charles V's daughter, on June 2, 1420. She was 18. He was 33. The marriage was political, but accounts suggest genuine affection developed between them. Henry V had won. He'd avenged a court with conquest. He'd forced France to accept English overlordship. He'd become heir to the greatest throne in Christendom. In December 1421, Catherine gave birth to a son, another Henry, who would inherit both kingdoms. Everything Henry had fought for was within his grasp. Then, in August 1422, while campaigning at the siege of Meaux, Henry contracted dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his army at Harel 7 years earlier. The same bloody flux that had killed thousands of his soldiers. Within weeks, the greatest warrior king England had produced in a century was dying in a room at the Château de Vincennes, unable to stand, unable to eat, his body evacuating blood and waste while physicians watched helplessly. On August 31, 1422, Henry V died. He was 35 years old. He had been king for 9 years. He'd conquered Normandy, become heir to France, and created a dual monarchy that should have lasted generations. He died 2 months before his father-in-law. On October 21, 1422, Charles V finally succumbed to his madness and his illnesses. The thrones of England and France passed to Henry V. A 9-month-old infant who'd never known his father. The dual monarchy Henry V had built was now ruled by a baby, and the Dauphin, disinherited by treaty but very much alive, immediately declared himself King Charles I of France and vowed to reclaim his kingdom. The war was far from over. The dual monarchy didn't survive a generation. Henry V proved to be everything his father wasn't. Pious to the point of weakness, gentle when the moment demanded ruthlessness, subject to bouts of madness that echoed his grandfather Charles V. Under his rule, everything Henry V had conquered slowly slipped away. The French rallied around Charles II, who proved far more capable than anyone expected. In 1429, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc claimed God had sent her to save France. Whether divine intervention or psychological warfare, her presence revitalized French resistance. English forces that had seemed invincible began losing. Town by town, fortress by fortress, France reclaimed itself. Normandy fell in 1450. Aquitaine, which England had held for 300 years, was lost. In 1453. By the time the 100 Years' War finally ended, England retained exactly one piece of French territory, Cala, and even that would be gone by 1558. All of Henry V's conquests, all of the blood and treasure spent, all of the strategic genius and battlefield triumphs gone within 30 years of his death. Yet, Agincourt endured not as a strategic turning point. It wasn't. Not as the decisive battle of the war. Wasn't that either. Agincourt endured as myth, as symbol, as the defining image of English military prowess and against all odds triumph. By the time William Shakespeare wrote Henry Veth in 1599, the battle had been transformed into legend. The play immortalized the St. Crissen's Day speech. "We few, we happy. Few, we band of brothers." Words Shakespeare invented but that captured something true about the battle's spirit. The king who fought alongside his men, the common soldiers elevated to heroes, the impossible victory through courage and faith. Shakespeare's Henry is noble, conflicted, but ultimately heroic. The play addresses the execution of the prisoners, but frames it as tragic necessity, not war crime. Henry gives the order reluctantly, burdened by command, doing what survival demands. It's a compelling portrait. It's also incomplete. The historical Henry V was more complex and considerably colder than Shakespeare's version. The man who transformed himself overnight from dissolute prince to pious king did so through sheer force of will, not divine grace. The king who burned his old friend alive for heresy believed absolutely in his own righteousness. The commander who ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners made a calculation survival over honor and never publicly expressed regret. Contemporary chroniclers were deeply troubled by the massacre. Some tried to justify it as military necessity. Others condemned it outright as a violation of the laws of war. A few simply recorded it without comment, as if the act was too enormous to judge. Henry himself never discussed it publicly. He commissioned masses for all who died at Agincourt, French and English alike. He endowed a monastery on the battlefield years later. But he never explained the order, never justified it, never apologized. Perhaps he believed God had judged him already and found the decision acceptable. After all, he'd survived the battle, conquered Normandy, become heir to France. Divine favor seemed clear. Or perhaps in the quiet moments when the crown was off and the courtiers were gone, he wrestled with what he'd done. We'll never know. Henry V didn't keep a diary, didn't write confessions. He ruled. He conquered. He died young. And he left behind a legacy that people have been arguing about for 600 years. What's undeniable is that Agincourt demonstrated something profound about warfare. That tactical innovation, disciplined troops, favorable terrain, and ruthless decision-making could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. But it also demonstrated something darker, that victory and virtue don't always align. That sometimes the right military decision is morally indefensible. That the mud of a battlefield can stain more than just armor. Return to the mud. October 25, 1415. That recently plowed field in northern France, turned by days of rain into a quagmire that would decide the fate of kingdoms. The French thought the mud would be their ally. They had the numbers, the armor, the professional military leadership. The muddy field would slow any English attack, make their archers vulnerable, allow French heavy infantry to close the distance, and crush them in melee. The terrain, they believed, favored the defender. They were right about that. They were just wrong about who was defending. When the French attacked across that field in their 60s of plate armor, the mud became the most effective weapon England had. It swallowed the French cavalry charge. Before it reached the English line, it exhausted the French vanguard before they could bring their numerical superiority to bear. It trapped thousands of armored men who fell and couldn't rise, who drowned in inches of water, who suffocated under the weight of their own dead. The field itself killed more French knights than English arrows or swords ever could. But mud is also a metaphor, and the mud attacking courts claimed more than just an army. Henry V won everything that day. He destroyed the French military leadership. He opened the path to his conquest of Normandy. He secured his claim to the French throne. He became one of the most celebrated warrior kings in English history. Agincourt made him immortal, and it cost him something that can't be measured in casualties or territory. The execution of the prisoners was a choice between survival and honor, between pragmatic necessity and moral law. Henry chose survival. He gave an order that violated every principle of chivalric warfare, and thousands of helpless men died because of it. Was he right? Militarily, yes. If the French Third Battle had attacked while English soldiers were guarding thousands of prisoners, the English army would have been destroyed. Henry saved his men by ordering the massacre. Was he justified? That's the question chroniclers have argued about for 600 years. Some say military necessity overrides moral law when survival is at stake. Others say murdering prisoners is a war crime regardless of circumstances. The debate continues because there's no easy answer. What we know is this: Henry never publicly explained the decision. He endowed masses for the dead. He built a monastery on the battlefield. But he never justified the order, never apologized, never discussed it. Perhaps he believed God had already judged him and found him righteous. After all, he'd survived, conquered, and triumphed. Perhaps in private moments, he carried the weight differently. We'll never know what he thought when the crown came off and he was alone with his conscience. Shakespeare glimpsed this truth when he wrote Henry V, wandering his camp in disguise the night before battle, wrestling with the burden of command upon the king. Let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children, and our sins lay on the king. The weight of those lives, the weight of those choices, the weight of winning at any cost. The mud of Agincourt swallowed a French army. But it also revealed what men become when survival demands the unforgivable. When the choice is between death with honor and life with blood on your hands. Henry V chose life. He chose victory. He chose his men over his soul, if that's what it cost. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Agincourt. Not that courage and faith can overcome impossible odds, though they can. Not that tactical innovation beats numerical superiority, though it does. But that some victories cost more than the lives lost in battle. That mud, literal and moral, clings to everyone who walks through it, that you can win everything and still lose something essential. The muddy field at Agincourt didn't just decide a battle. It revealed the price of being king, the cost of survival, the weight of choices that can never be unmade. The mud claimed them all in the end. Some in body, some in soul. And 600 years later, we're still trying to wash it clean. If you found this story worth your time, please like this video. Subscribe to Dark History Class for more narratives that don't shy away from the complexity of the past, and share this with someone who appreciates history told honestly. Here's the question I want you to think about. If you were Henry V in that moment, exhausted, outnumbered, facing potential annihilation, if the French attacked again, would you have given the same order, military necessity or war, crime, survival or honor? Drop your perspective in the comments. I genuinely want to hear what you think. Because this isn't just about a battle 600 years ago. It's about the choices we make when everything is on the line. Thanks for watching.